Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lum.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, welcome everyone to another episode of the Cardiff Met Sport Coaching Hub podcast. We are joined today by Dr Harley-Jean Simpson. Harley, welcome to the pod.
Hey team, thank you for the invite.
A debut appearance for you on the Coaching Hub podcast. Why don't you give the listeners a bit of an introduction to yourself? Where did coaching start for you and how have your career and studies led you to where you are now?
Yeah, this was a really nice question to start with because I think sometimes we lose track of that, and it was nice to reflect back on, why I'm sat in the chair now, I guess. And I just remember thinking about sport from a really early age, and I was always just so fascinated about playing sport, whether it's football, badminton, tennis, basketball, anything. It was just sport. And I think as I got a little bit older, I started to ask some questions around, why do we do what we do, and why am I being coached in a certain way? And it's probably from about 16 I started to ask some really big questions, and I never really got any black or white answers. It was like, there might be this reason or that reason, and I just remember being a little bit frustrated with some of those answers, and I think that's where I really started to find my lane, I guess. I like that analogy of thinking about this in a little bit more depth. So I carried on playing, carried on coaching, mainly football, but then started to find a little bit of interest in, what is the justification of some of these decisions? Why am I being coached this way? Why am I playing this way? So I guess that's on reflection where it all came from, really. Yeah,
that's good. And we were reflecting just before we hit record about sort of the last time that I saw you, which was way back in 2019, Crick conference in Worcester, and you were presenting. I think it was the early ideas of your PhD. It wasn't even necessarily that you'd landed on anything, and so what we're going to talk about now is this like a culmination of some of the research that you've been doing? Is this an additional project? Where's the distance travelled from then until now?
Yeah, so I think in 2019 at Crick, I hadn't actually started the PhD. So I can't imagine what ideas I presented back then. They probably would have been a bit wild, to be honest. But so the paper today is just about that journey, that role of the researcher. And during a PhD, I felt a lot of vulnerability. I felt a little bit out my depth at times, and some of the work I was doing was really messy and challenging. It wasn't straightforward, and I think I just wanted to, I thought I can't be the only one here thinking like this. I can't be the only one, worrying about some of these vulnerabilities. And I think it's easier to hide things that don't go to plan. We're good at that. And I just really wanted to try and show some good practice, but, be honest about the messiness of it. And this paper is just a journey of that data collection, essentially. So, yeah, that's where it began, really.
Mm. And is that something you've always been interested in, kind of the methodological aspect, rather than going for potentially looking to publish some of the findings first? You've gone here to really go into that process. Like, why is it that you went that direction rather than like a more traditional paper, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, so the traditional papers are in the plan for sure, but I think I wanted to start off with something that my supervisor always says, plant your flag in the sand. What do you want to be known for? What do you want to show contributing to the field? And I was always fascinated with raising the curtain on some of the vulnerabilities, trying to, how do we navigate the field? How do we, when we're in that notion of being out there and trying to navigate our way, I thought, why not better off start with something that's a little bit pedagogical, trying to show some good practice, and then, the traditional papers could follow that. So that was kind of my plan and thinking and obviously still in the middle of all of that, really. But yeah, just to show some of that backstage thinking, raising the curtain on that. I think it's really important that we demonstrate some of that in the qualitative field.
Yeah, it's great. It's really interesting. I have to say, before we get into some of the detail, I really resonated with some of the stories that you've told in the paper. Having gone through some ethnographic work myself with a PhD and some other projects, it was nice to read that other people are having similar challenges, which again we'll break down in a bit more detail later in the pod.
Yeah, nice.
Can we start a little bit though with this notion of trust? So you've used trust and specifically Stompke's work. But what was it about trust that you thought, or what drew you to trust as a concept? Why did you think this was going to be of value to you in this particular paper?
Yeah, so it wasn't something that was obvious at the start. I threw myself into this context, but I started to realize I wasn't trusted, that it was a restricted context. I honestly just had no access at all. I couldn't even physically get into the building, and it was such an awkward time for me, to be honest, as a researcher, not knowing what I'm doing really. So the theory of trust was I came across it. It's a sociological theory, and it tries to be explicit about these everyday interactions. And I thought, oh, that fits at the moment. There's some sort of fit here to try and underpin some of these moments that I'm having, and it's formed through loyalty and solidarity and reciprocal exchanges and these social interactions. Even though I wasn't having any, I could see how, well, I'm not trusted. But part of the theory, it speaks about, there's no means of bridging that anonymous gap other than resorting to trust. And I never lost sight of that. It was like, there is no way of gaining entry or gaining access into this place without someone trusting me. So I carried on thinking about this theoretical lens for quite a few months, really, but not holding on to it. It was very loose in the back of my mind, and I just thought, I'm going to run with the data. But I knew there was this element of trust in the back of my mind. And I guess that's where the theory was born out. And then the more I got into the mist of ethnography, it became really obvious that this theory could help underpin some of those really tricky moments, but also wonderful moments when you do gain a little bit of trust and you're in. So it was just a theory that I thought, hey, this could offer some insight practically, but theory underpinning that process with theory. So yeah, that's where it came from, really.
Can you chat a bit about, I guess, balancing some of those aims really there in terms of thinking about trust in a practical sense and trying to really gain that trust, but also trying to use it as a lens to understand? How did you go about that process?
Yeah, honestly, there was no process, and this is the messiness of it. I think I never want to be afraid to be honest about the messiness of qualitative work. It wasn't clean cut. It wasn't polished at all. This was some real putting together of trying to explain some of these really strange moments that we often gloss over. And I think that's the important point of, we do gloss over them. But the theory was, it speaks about an epistemological gap. And I it's quite a complicated term, but actually real simple terms here. There was not enough knowledge between me and the coaches. There was not enough resonance. I was almost an outsider immediately. So there was this gap between us. But there was no way of knowing what that gap was without trying to, interact with them and get to know them. And therefore we do simply have to trust that start of that process. And that's where I started to just be a little bit, I can understand why they're being guarded. I can understand why there's some safe routines in place. There is no freedom here. I can't roam around the arena. I can't, let myself in. That just doesn't exist here. But the more investment I was trying to show And my motives, I needed to show some motives here. I wasn't here to cause harm. I was simply here just to try and be a part of something. There's a term about, you heard it, sticking your neck out on the line. And at this point, the coach wasn't willing to do that. He was like, no, I don't want anyone in here. So I could feel myself wrestling with that real concept of I'm not trusted, but how can I be trusted? But you've got to be authentic about that. You can't just, say, I'm trusted now, because, you're not at times. So it's a real wrestle.
Yeah, sorry, Ollie. I think there's something that's quite a challenging thing there, which is we talk about it a lot within even our undergrad programs, masters particularly, and especially at doctoral level. That notion of authenticity, when actually what you're doing is you're trying to manipulate environments and almost manipulate people to gain access to these kind of things. Sometimes it almost seems like, well, I toy around and I mess around in my head all the time with this notion of, well, this kind of this manipulative person that I could potentially be. Well, where's the borderline here between being ethical, unethical, being good, bad, just following simple moral and social protocol even, and things like trust, for example. If you have a deeper understanding of things like trust, well, can you manipulate people into trusting you a little bit more then? And then all of a sudden it becomes this weird kind of ethical debate. How did you find yourself trying to manage that a little bit? Was that understanding or that sort of critical thinking of the self there when you were writing about this? Is this something that's come later?
Do you know, that's a really nice question, because you can, the more you understand it, the more you are available to understand the concepts and how, you can negotiate a little bit more. And then you are at risk of losing that authenticity. But at the time of starting to gain access and gain entry, I didn't have that insight. I didn't have that understanding. I was just a desperate researcher, and in the paper I talk about being reluctant and apologetic, and I didn't have any concept of that theoretical understanding at that level. It was just non-existent. I was just this person with a backpack running around trying to get into the building, trying to take notes but not look like that person sat in the corner taking notes. It's I was trying to real balance those tensions. But towards the end, I think I talk about maturing into the role, but it wasn't till the very end where I realized, oh gosh, I'm trusted here. But that also then brings responsibility of being trusted. So throughout the stories, you can see how actually the more I became trusted, the more responsibility I had. There was more trust to break or lose. So I often just found myself I talk about the juggling act, and that's exactly what it is. And that's why Tracy's continuum of enmeshment made real sense to me, because you're never just in, you're never just out. It's a real overlapping process of just really trying to balance that act at times, which is very difficult, I think.
Yeah, could you just, chat a bit about, I guess, what they expected you to do? Because I think a lot of people almost, as soon as you're given access, if you like, to come and observe a session or take part in some ethnographic work, there's an assumption that you're going to have actual access right away because someone said, oh yeah, come down to training or whatever it is. What do you think the coaches actually expected you to be doing?
Not much, actually, because as I went into the role, I downplayed the research, and I became this hesitant individual where I had nothing to offer, and that was what it was. And I think the coach, Mike, who I talk about, the head coach, he saw straight through that, and he thought, he probably thought, who's this numpty now? I've got so much to do. I haven't got time for this. And and that's where I had to, try and fix the problem in the first instance, because there was no expectation. I probably went in and they thought, oh, who's this now? And I had to really overcome that first milestone, because I think I just lacked a little bit of confidence as well. And I remember doing my ethics form and speaking to my supervisors, and they were like, "Yeah, off you go. You can go and start collecting data." And I just had this initial shock of like, I can't even get in the building. How am I supposed to collect anything? And for a good month or so, I didn't get any data. And I started to panic, and I thought, have I messed up my PhD here? Is that it's only a 3-year studentship, and I'm already behind. That instant thought you get. So there was no expectation, but with that, I did lose sight of why I was there. I lost sight of what am I supposed to do now. So yeah, a little bit of a challenge at the start, and I don't think they didn't see me as a very, I don't know, I lost value a little bit, and that was the first hurdle. Hence why I needed a little bit of agency from one of my supervisors just to get me through the door, really. Yeah, so no expectation. Well, not that I thought at the time, for sure.
That's good. You've mentioned a little bit about data collection, so this might be a nice time just to talk a touch about methodology.
Yeah.
You've taken an approach of telling confessional tales here, and potentially on all of the episodes we've done on the podcast, that's the first time that this approach has come up in conversation. So just for some insight for our listeners, what's a confessional tale? What separates it from just stories and narratives that maybe some others might be familiar with?
Van Maanen's 1988 is where I got this from, and I remember just being fascinated with the whole idea of telling a story. I guess this is where my messiness side comes in, where my supervisors were saying, "Hey, we want a nice, clean cut PhD. Don't go too far out of the borders here." And I remember almost falling upon this. It was just by luck, really, that I was reading around. The toolbox of qualitative work. What can we access to tell a story? I came across letters, diaries, etc., and I thought that's not really what I want here. And I wanted something that could adopt like a personal style of writing. Thinking about the author's perspective here, thinking about my worldviews, and trying to take whoever's reading the work behind the scenes. I think sometimes we get this polished, neat version of traditional data, and we often see, a great set of data, but sometimes I think, well, how did you get there? That's sometimes as important as getting there and telling us the results. So yeah, this idea of confessional tale just puts you right at the heart of that, and gives you license to tell those private mistakes and those personal feelings, and just be really honest. And I don't know how much we get of that, get that real honesty from the field sometimes. And that's not me being critical. That's just me trying to be really honest about the difficulties of qualitative work. So the confessional tale just really gave a lens for that, and let's try and be a little bit more diverse with at times some of the methods that we can talk about. So yeah, that's the honest version of a confessional tale, I think.
Yeah, and speaking of, you mentioned a clean cut PhD, as well as confessional tales. You also went for an arts-based methodology, which again, like you say, is being more experimental, is being maybe more diverse with the methods that you use. So what was the intention behind the drawings and the photos that you used within the work?
Yeah, I think during my PhD, my supervisors were really good at, thinking about my strengths. And at the time, and still now, I'm not the best writer by far, but I've got some sort of skill set in terms of offering something visual. So whether that is a drawing, a photo, and then, articulating my thoughts. And I thought, I need to use some of my strengths here. I'm already lacking in confidence. So what can I do to make this work? And I just had this idea of this arts-based methodology of just a form of wandering. And that's just exactly what it was, is me wandering around the corridors. And that's where the method really came alive, and thinking about my day-to-day experiences and sense making through some of those photographs and drawings. And some of the papers in this area really articulate that really well. And they say stuff like, it's a process of showing rather than telling. And I thought, do you know what? That's exactly where my strength is. I can't tell you, but I can show you. And that's where at the time I thought I can somehow articulate what's going on in a different way. But methodologically, it helped me to slow down, and I think we're in such a quick process, like get this done, get that done, move on. But then a term from Ford 2021 paper, explains this really well, a process of walking through the data. And I was like, yeah, that is exactly what I'm doing here. There's nothing quick about this process to me. It was hours of work, of wandering around. So there's a strength here in just trying to explain this data in a different way. But, nonetheless, it was very messy, very messy. And it took some time to pull together to demonstrate this as knowledge. What is knowledge when we're looking at a photo? What is knowledge when we're looking at a sketch or a drawing? But it was just a different way of knowing. So I really held on to that.
Well, there's a few of them that are actually in the paper itself, and the link will be for everyone in the paper and in the podcast description, so they can go and have a look for themselves. But what was the intention, or what do you think is the benefit that's brought to the paper by including some of that artistic work within the paper? Is it to try and give some sort of sense making to the writing? Is it just like an initial step, try and create some impression to start with for each of the tales, or what is it?
I think honestly, it's just my personal preference here. I love images. I love photos. I remember being young and just like, oh no, I want something with pictures in, Yeah. And so honestly, that's probably where some of that's coming from. But I rarely see any visuals in articles, and that's probably a good thing. But there's an element of can we show something in a different way? Can we articulate something that the readers can maybe hold on to for a little bit longer than and take with them through the paper, rather than just the next paragraph or the next results section. So I put them in there just to try and set the scene of the story, and give some context through some of those pictures. But again, just a different way of feeling, a different way of knowing. And hopefully, you can resonate with some of those images in your own experiences. So, yeah, but more a preference for me, really. Okay. I've got to be honest. Yeah. So. And
some of them there's a couple of photos, but some of them are sketches as well. Your own work. I'm interested in those sketches. Did you draw these sketches sort of in situ? You sat in one of the hallways and you draw it. Are these like post data collection and you're thinking back and trying to illustrate how you were feeling in that, where's the temporal aspect of this? When did they happen?
There was no real moment of, there's no pattern here. It was just, for example, if I'm sat in the reception area, waiting for someone to let me in, that is simply some of the moments where I had nothing to do. But I'm just waiting for the right moment to say, oh, come in. And that could have been 10 minutes or an hour. So I would sit around just thinking about my research, thinking about why I'm not allowed in. So the image of the drawing of, it's actually myself, of just being on my own. There was no one around. It was just simply me here. And I don't know where that really came from, but I think it had a strong message of just constantly being an outsider. I'm not with anyone. I'm not part of the team. But as you can see, then the images and the photos started to become a little bit more in depth, like the image in the office with everything going on the board. And so, it was just a way to try and articulate that, but no pattern. Sometimes I'd get home and I'd think, that's a nice idea. Wouldn't really be able to put it on paper as words because I couldn't understand it at that point. So I'd just sketch something out or take photos, because then through the process of the data analysis, those photos took on more meanings or deeper meanings, engaging with my supervisors and challenging that. So it was just a nice way to look back as well. Yeah.
And I think that's the key with these drawings, right? And you mentioned them as, I guess, being employed as verbs, so that they're not created for an exhibition for someone else, but they're part of your own sense-making process. And I think what you mentioned about, I guess, readers resonating with it as well, they can start to come up with their own interpretations of your experiences, which I guess is the great power of this paper.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that would be a good win, right? And but when my supervisor said, "Oh, you could put these photos in the PhD or put the images, the sketches," I was like, "Oh no, I'm not sure about that because they're mine." But then I started to think about, actually, why not? And why not show some real backstage context? So yeah, it just came about in a way of showing them, like you said, not for exhibition, but for exhibition. Sorry, not expedition, exhibition. Not there wasn't really supposed to be published, but here they are. Yeah.
Kind of encompasses that idea that all is data, everything,
Yeah.
all those experiences, your notes, the things people say, of course, but also your reflections and, your logs, your little scribbles and sketches. It's all data at the end of the day. So, yeah, I think it's a nice, meaningful paper in terms of there's lots of other things that are probably not presented in published research that actually could be really, really powerful. And I suppose one thing with that is that you've got therefore so much data in a piece of work like this, and you talk about how you use Smith and Sparks' idea of narrative indwelling. You've kind of really tried to, like you say, walk through the data and really immerse yourself in it. How did you manage that really deep immersion in the data, though? Because there must be so much there; it can very easily become tough to see the wood from the trees. How did you maintain some level of distance or criticality with all of that data that you had?
Yeah, no, I didn't really understand this idea of narrative indwelling at the time. I think it's only now I look back and go, do you know what? I gave it a good go. I tried to understand this term, and I tried to, really walk through the data. But at times, like you said, you don't know you're doing it. It's a time where it's just happening to you. And then you look back and you go, oh, yeah, that actually happened. Or a moment happened and you're panicking and you're being told off, when the coach in the paper was telling me off. And, I'm navigating all this messiness. And there was times where I'd have to use the critical friends, and not in a way of surface level here. This was real debates, real challenges. And I would show them my reflective diary and say, is this really happening? Is it supposed to feel like this? Am I supposed to be experiencing this? And all sorts of questions would come out. And I really learned about this. It's not about that confirmability. Don't just agree with me. Challenge me. It's got to be a reflective dialogue here. And I really understood that through this process. And therefore, then, the moments, the pictures and the images and the reflections started to really take on new meaning. And therefore, I felt like I was this storyteller. I became, we talk about narrative thematic analysis, and it's not what the story does, it's what the story, does for the storyteller. What am I trying to tell here? What am I trying to do here? And I didn't really understand the term narrative indwelling back then, but I think I do now, really trying to walk through that data, and the importance of having others to see the data because you're in it. It is significant, really.
And linking quite nicely to that, you mentioned adopting a connoisseurial attitude in terms of how your tale should be judged. Could you talk a bit more around that?
Yeah, so I find myself obsessed with this word, especially when it comes to coffee. But I think, with the paper, it's a story, isn't it? So there's no conventional objective statements here, that it's not coming from that. And therefore, I think it's important to say, okay, well, let's set the parameters. Let's get into some of these details. Let's be critical here about the story. There's no objective statement, so let's set some boundaries for that. And therefore, I just wanted to guide the reader to say, hey, maybe judge us on this aspect. And therefore, we're asking questions like, does this resonate with you? We're thinking of Brett Smith's terms here of naturalistic generalizations, but does this story offer meaningful? Does this story offer a meaningful picture? That's important here. Is it showing empathy and respect for all participants? And with that hope at the end to learn something new, or reflect and stimulate curiosity or provoke action. So it's just that connoisseurial attitude is saying to the reader, be critical, but this is the parameters I want you to be critical in, and this is where we're coming from. And I honestly think that's really important for qualitative work. It's something that I can't lose sight of. I think we should set the ground exactly where the writer is coming from, and it gives the reader then, I guess, a jump start into say, okay, I understand, therefore I'll judge you on this. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but it feels relevant to me in terms of how I write at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important thing, right? That the way you want your research to be judged should be how others judge it, or the criteria they use to judge it anyway.
Yeah, I think you always get some kickback for that. But if you try and say, hey, this is the parameters, just to stay with me here on this story or this journey, and then if you get to the end of the paper and you're still not on board, then fine. At least I tried to show you, guide you with some of those questions.
Let's get into, I guess, your stories then, into the real good stuff, the real data. And your first one you've mentioned, I guess, throughout the podcast already. So this is the one that is kind of begins with the sketch of yourself feeling alone, and it's all about who is Harley-Jean essentially, and who you are as that outsider. So why is it so important to start with this, I suppose, to start with yourself and essentially about who you are?
Yeah, I think it's important to, I spoke to other students or PhD students about being an ethnographer or throwing yourself into a field. And I think it's important to just show a little bit of vulnerability. As you can see in the plot one, I needed a bit of agency. I couldn't have done this on my own. I didn't have the legitimacy of being there, and therefore that played a big role. So when we go out into the field, who's that person that will help you gain access? Who's that person who will introduce you? So you're not on your own. You don't have to do this on your own. But, over time, I started to use my own agency to talk about playing experiences at a high level. That gained me so much credibility. Amazing how that was highlighted as a huge moment. Qualifications. Whereas this PhD title, they didn't care about. They were just like, yeah, fine. So it's interesting how other elements of life were valued. And, I began just hanging around, just began waiting for those corridor moments to be able to be let in. And, it was awkward. There was that initial shock of being like, why am I here? I'm just wasting my time. I'm being a nuisance. And I think as ethnographers, we do often face that. I mean, there are luxury moments where you're allowed in and you're in, and that's great. But there are those moments when you just feel such like an outsider. And I think it's important to share that, because the way I felt at the time, I thought, maybe I've done this wrong and I should have done something else. Or so, yeah, I think it's just important to start with a bit of vulnerability, really.
Yeah, I could really feel that tension myself, reading the paper, feel the tension in that story. And within the story, you talk about that researcher-participant dichotomy You know, it's not
Yeah.
just distance in a sense of I don't feel part of this, but quite literal physical distance, like you've already spoken about. You're not even allowed through the front door. You know, there's no card access to certain
Yeah.
places, or you know, people have no time for you as a researcher. You know, I could really feel that, not just in the research, sort of my experience of research, but other work that I'm doing, you know, stepping into new roles as a coach developer, as a teacher, even at the university. It's a very new space, and, you know, those ideas of trust really shine through. What I'm interested in, though, is, and we all know what it's like being, you know, a younger academic, new into a PhD research, new into an environment, and feeling that sense of vulnerability. How did you face up to that challenge and even pluck up the courage to just keep going when everything felt so sort of weighted against you?
I can't take the credit here. It wasn't all me. You know, I had three great supervisors at the time, just helping me in different ways. And they all, I guess, you know, would use their strengths to say, think about this, think about that. But Andy specifically was the one who, you know, would say, you can't give up here. You know, I'll come with you. And he would physically come with me. To the, you know, the space where they trained, and just having him on side, I felt a little bit more comfortable. I thought, okay, maybe this is going to be all right, and you know, maybe this is not going to be as bad as I thought it was with this initial shock. But there was a moment of, you know, where you do feel way out of your depth, and I think people can resonate with that in all aspects of life, whether it's a new job, you know, like you said, starting a new teaching role or a new coaching role. And at times you have that moment where you go, I am out my depth here. I've got nothing to offer. And, you know, it might be a personality trait. And, you know, that's something obviously personally you've got to overcome. But for sure, we have those moments. But having someone there just to reassure you. And I had to do a lot of work with my supervisors to, you know, maybe change the plan, change my approach, think about my attire, you know, lose the backpack and the notepad, you know, it's not helpful here. You know, try something different, try being early, you know, being on time before anyone else gets there. So you're literally at the door before they're even in the building. So you walk in with them. And there were so many little tactics that I just tried to throw in. But there was a moment when I thought, got nothing to lose now. You know, I've put the work in, and you know, if it doesn't pay off, it doesn't pay off. And then all of a sudden there was a few then turning points, hence story 2. And but there was a lot of shifting around, and I guess playing around with the tactics really to even get anywhere near the front door first.
Yeah, before we get on to that story 2, just on story 1 still, you mentioned some of those interactions with Mike, the head coach, and talking about timing and bad timing, and potentially even being apologetic about your study and almost saying, oh, you don't have to do this, I can go. And you mentioned thinking, well, yeah, please don't actually agree to that. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so oh gosh, I forgot about that, but it's true. You know, this apologetic approach isn't my own work really. This is Mason Bish's work, and you know, they talk about being this reluctant researcher. It's not in the field of sport, so I kind of stole that. But you know, this idea of being really apologetic, you know, when we feel like a nuisance, we've all been there. Where, oh, I'm really sorry, you know, sorry for wasting your time. But what that did was put me in a place of being really hesitant. And I think from the coach's side, they don't have time, you know, for a lot of things that are extra. So all of a sudden it's like, so who's this person? They're, you know, they seem hesitant. They seem like they don't know what they're doing. And that's how I think I came across in the end, because I was essentially undervaluing what I had to offer. So, you know, it did take a little bit of time to readdress that. And therefore I may have lost trust on reflection. Now, this is in the paper because I've only just thought about it. But, you know, I may have lost some trust there, thinking about, you know, being this hesitant person. And he didn't have time for that. So I think there is something pedagogically to think about when, you know, how concrete is the plan? You know, this is what I want from you. This is how I can do it. And there's show those motives really early on, where I was just this really apologetic. I'm sorry for being in the way, So yeah, there's something around that I think we can all learn from to some extent going forward.
I think that speaks a touch to, perhaps that idea of like needing to be useful to someone in the context. They've invited you in, and they don't want you to just sit there and do nothing, or just feel like almost like you're eavesdropping and things like that. And that carries through really nicely into the second story, which comes with a slightly provocative title, which is Passing the Coach's Test, as if the coach is sort of laying traps and challenges and and obstacles almost for you to overcome in order to become trusted. Could you tell us a little bit about what that test was in this particular context? How did it impact your existence in the field and then indeed in doing the work?
So like you said, when I sat down with the coach and I said, hey, this is the paper, and he said, oh, is that how you really felt? Is that what really happened? And we had a really nice conversation, and I said, to be honest, yeah, because you didn't let me in. You didn't allow me anywhere near the court. And the moments when I did get to the court, there were still tests, there were still moments of, am I proving my worth now being sat courtside? I'm out from the reception area. I've proved my way in. Now I'm proving myself again. So it's like a constant whirlwind of trying to prove my existence in that context. And now, you can be really critical and it sounds mean, but it's not. Remember, this was a high performance setting. There was jobs at risk. There was so much going on at the time. So, that there was some elements of tests. Why would you let anybody into a context? You don't know what their motives are. You don't know, what's behind the research. So, but I realised that, with that, there was no quick fix. Months of work, and you'd feel movement. You'd feel, oh, I'm closer. And I use like the peripheral term where, you're out on the periphery and times you move in, times you move back out. But it was about gaining some sort of cultural familiarity of trying to understand what is going on. How can I be a part of this? But I think, as a PhD student back then, and even now, Laura Purdy's work was great in helping me dissect some of those roles and the tensions and the balancing of the juggling act, and a few other academics was great for me here to try and understand that. And I've put in the paper, I became the most enthusiastic person in the room, where no job was too much. They'd say, oh, could you grab the ice packs? Could you grab the towels? And I'd just do it, because I thought, how else can I prove to them that I'm here to cause no harm? I'm not here to spy or listen and probably one of my favourite bits in the paper is when I spoke about becoming the scoreboard wizard. Basketball is not my sport. And at the time, this was probably the first time I got courtside. So you can imagine I'm absolutely, so excited to be anywhere near the court, because I can see the coaching now, I can hear things. And the coach was like, oh, can you do the scoreboard? And I was like, again, out my depth, no idea what to do. There's about 1,000 buttons on this thing, and immediate panic. And I had to ask one of the players, how embarrassing, just like, what do I do? And I can see the coach looking at me, and I thought, any minute now, he's just going to tell me to get out, pretty much. But somehow I managed it. But I put in the paper about the foul counts, because I literally had no idea. And I think he gave me a little bit of leeway there, and he smiled, and I thought, oh gosh, I've got away with that there to some extent. And that was the first moment where I thought, oh, I might be in. I feel a little bit of movement. I feel closer. And I'd keep that job list. I talk about a populated job list in my pocket. And I think this really stood out to Mike, where I would simply write stuff down, so I wouldn't have to keep asking him to say, oh, can I help you? Can I do that? I would write stuff down and pick up patterns. So, he could see I was taking initiative. And I think he became less hesitant. He started to see my motives. He started to see my intentions and a little bit of loyalty. I'm here before you, so, I'm early and I'm helping you set up. We got lunch together, and you can then start to feel how I'm now juggling maybe a different identity in the field. I'm not one of them, though. I'm still very aware of my position here. He was still guarded about stuff. He wouldn't tell me when the team stuff came out. I would be removed from stuff like that. But those passing corridor conversations became a little bit more in depth, and I started to prove my worth, I think. Yeah.
Spending so much time, so much energy trying to, I guess, get in. How concerned were you that you weren't getting what you wanted? Like, you were getting in, but maybe you weren't able to really collect the data that originally you'd envisaged collecting because you're so concerned with just getting in itself.
Honestly, that was probably my biggest worry. Because this is, I was on a PhD studentship, so I don't have loads of time here, and I do remember thinking about deadlines and the what does the data even look like? I remember my PhD was about this coach's decision making. So at this time, I had no idea what decisions he was making because I couldn't get anywhere near him. And, I would go and watch the games at the weekend, but again, you're still very removed from what is actually going on. You can make assumptions, you can have a guess at what's going on, but you simply don't know what's going on. So for a good probably 6 months, I had nothing, absolutely nothing. But through the reassurance of my supervisors and maybe at times, I don't know how honest they would be, maybe at times they probably thought, is this even working? Because it's on them as well, isn't it? So there's an element, and I've never spoke to them about that really, but I wonder if that was the case. How many times did they say, have we should we have helped Harley pick a different context? Because for those 6 months I had absolutely nothing on the topic that I needed. But, looking back, you have all this then. So, swings and roundabouts, right? So, absolutely nothing at the time. That's the vulnerability, though, isn't it? That's when things don't go to plan. Let's stop hiding them.
And like you say, that's the data in itself. And you mentioned right at the start of the paper, the importance of the social behind those decision-making aspects. And at the time, like you say, you probably didn't realize that this was actually it was the real kind of nuggets of your data, was the fact that you couldn't get what you wanted because of the issues in navigating the social context. Yeah,
of course. And the way my PhD turned out was the best possible outcome for me and the data, because it was about that social element, and the decisions became more about, socially rootedness of them. It isn't just about A to B. It's about how did we end up in A to get to B? It's about the baggage that comes behind a decision. And at the start of my PhD, I didn't have any of that insight. So without knowing it was a really nice start. That feels weird to say now, but it was a nice, uncomfortable start to appreciate some of the backdrop and those hidden layers of the, those everyday social complexities of decisions. And I wouldn't have got that otherwise. So, without knowing, it worked out just fine. Yeah.
And so becoming part of the team, if you like, gaining that trust, building those relationships, that also, whilst it was nice to get into it, opened up different challenges for you. It was almost like out the frying pan into the fire type stuff. The banter, the expectations, the standards that you all of a sudden had to sort of uphold. What was it like coping with that? How were you able to still manage just doing the research bit whilst also being so immersed in something like this?
Yeah, I think, and this was probably one of the moments where you then start to figure out you are you are showing different hats or different elements of your identity at times. You're really starting to balance, or not, rather, some of those tensions. And it did really become this balancing act. And that, I think that's one way to really explain. And Tracy's continued enmeshment was at play. It simply was at play, where there wasn't a black and white, version of this. It was grey. It was really, a conflict. I was really at times really conflicted with what I thought was right, what I thought was wrong. But there was an emotional aspect to that, because you remember my positionality here. I was a female in a male sport, different identities, different backgrounds, and you're throwing that all into a mixing pot. And the coach, maybe the coach was also thinking about elements of, I was the only female in the room, and whether people will say, does that matter or not? But you've got to think about how all of this is at play, and therefore sometimes it can win you a place, or you're then at the front door again. And this is where I really understood that idea of continuous enmeshment, because you're not in, you're not out. Critically, I'm not sure that is as black and white as sometimes we feel. And it does become this real balancing act of balancing the tensions. Yeah.
Following on then, plot 3 starts with a photo within the office itself, and you mentioned that you now call Mike, you call him coach.
Yeah.
So even the language you've used with him has changed. Tell us a bit about how you got to this point, from being courtside and that being a massive thing, to being able to sit in while he's on the phone having a conversation.
Yeah, well, it was, months of work. This wasn't weeks here, this was months of work. And I remember him, I could hear, everyone else would call him coach and I would call him Mike. And I thought, well, maybe I can't really call him coach. He's not my coach. You have these thoughts in your head. And then we was at practice one day and he said, just call me coach. I was like, okay, no worries. I'll call you coach. And just little moments like that started to happen. He would say, oh, you want to come out with the lads, and after practice, we're just going to go for some food, real downtime. Everyone else is coming, so would you like to come? And I thought, yeah, like, why not? And I started to just feel a real shift here. This was where, stories would be told, personal information would be shared over food and drinks. And it became we had a real connectedness now. I can't say, I was fully part of the team, but it felt different. I had kit, I had my own coffee cup. I mean, that was a wonderful moment when the coach was like, stop using everyone else's cup, use your own. And it's moments like that where you think, okay, there's a shift here. There's almost like transition points where things are constantly shifting, changing, evolving, but you feel closer. But with that, I said earlier that there's now a level of trust to be betrayed, and this is where Stomska's work, you can really see the trust has been gained, but actually with that, you can then betray it. You can lose that trust really easily, and through that sense of togetherness and human interaction and loyalty and solidarity, all those really nice human terms, was where I started to feel, oh, I'm in. You don't want to get carried away with that, but you feel like you're to some extent at the centre of it. I could see the decisions being made. I could see the influences, the impact, the build up to game day. I was witnessing, but it comes at a personal sacrifice, and I've not seen much around ethnographic work talking about personal sacrifice. I was there 12 hours a day, 7 days, sometimes and it was a heavy load on. I've never experienced like that. Ethically, was it right? But you got to go with the data, right? You got to throw yourself into their world, and that was that dichotomy. I wasn't in their world. I'd turn up for 3 hours and expect the world, where when you're then throwing yourself into their context and saying the coach gets here at 8 a.m. he doesn't leave till 10 p.m. He eats there, he sleeps there, he rests, all of that is his world. So if I want to get into that and understand who he is as a coach and the team and how decisions are really made, then there is that personal sacrifice. So that was where plot 3 really changed, and I started to really understand some of the highs and lows of high performance sport.
And the photograph that you've presented in here is just of one of the walls in the office, a whiteboard up on the wall. Obviously, you couldn't take a photo of the coach himself and things like that for ethical reasons. But what it does paint a picture of is you sat in a room whilst an individual, the coach, is having a conversation, not just a personal call, but with a mentor, where he's going to be sharing vulnerabilities, questions, challenges that he's facing, almost dropping his guard a little bit, just sort of unveiling himself as, okay, I'm a coach in high performance sport, but even I've got worries or concerns here. What did that moment feel like, and how have you tried to encapsulate that within the photo and within what you've shared in the tale?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the title of the paper come in. You're trusted now, you can stay. And those were his words. Normally the phone would ring and you get up because, it's a polite thing to do. You think, I'm not welcome here, I'll leave. I'll leave all my bags behind. And if the phone calls an hour, then I'll just stand outside for an hour. That's the part of the process. And as the phone started to ring, I honestly started to get up out of my chair. And he turned around and he gave me the sign of stay. And he said, you're trusted now, stay. And in that moment, you think, it's a relief, but you don't know what the call even is yet. So there was a little bit of hesitation, thinking, I don't really want to hear, whatever's going to go on. But then he deliberately turned up. They didn't put the person on loudspeaker. I don't know why, but in the moment, he turned up the volume and looked back. And I was like, what's happening? And then I realized it was his mentor. And the paper that I'm writing now will start to get into that and the backstory of decisions. But this was a low point for the coach. This was him sharing some of those his own vulnerabilities, right? And we talk about my own, but he was starting to then show me his. Now I get this front version of him and this polished coach. That's what we see in sport, right? And Jones's paper, fixing the tie, right? We see all of that, and then they're in. But this was me seeing him worry about the game at the weekend. Telling his mentor, "Hey, we might not win this. We're not ready. We're not good enough. We haven't got the roster ready." There's all these moments of panic for him. And this was 2 days before game day. So arguably, this is not where we want to be. And the investment we're all putting in and the time and effort. So I'm almost battling in my head now going, I'm excited. I'm at the heart of my research question. But actually, I can't be excited because there's an element of maturing into this role as a researcher. If I just sat there with a big smile on my face, he'd have been like, have you not just heard that conversation? So there was a real element of me honestly sat in the chair thinking, right, what's the right thing to do here? I'm excited with my research hat on because I'm at the center, I'm at the heart of my research question, but there's a human being in front of me with huge amounts of worry for the game at the weekend. And this was a big game, it was on Sky. So, there's all these elements at play. And I think I've started to really understand that idea of being empathetic to coaches and the life that they have at times, where it isn't this front version where everything's great. It's that story. And when they do step onto that court, and the fans and media and everything, see that version, I think it's something to be cautious of at times, So it was a really fascinating moment, pulling on different types of emotions. But I think that's when, and in the paper, I've tried to articulate, you got to mature into that space. Because there was no point me looking at him after the call going, oh, big smile on my face, I'm in. So yeah, it was an interesting point. Definitely a shift again. Talk about juggling act, another shift in the research.
And that almost marks the end of those confessionary tales, the end of your 3 plots, and we'd urge those listening to go and read them for themselves. But I guess to give the listeners and potential readers an insight, what is it that you'd really like coaches and scholars to take from these tales? If you wanted like one thing, if people read the paper, what's the one thing you'd love them to just take from it?
I don't have one thing. I have a few things, so I'll just go with
as many as you
things. Like. I don't have a perfect one fit approach here, and I just don't think it's as clean cut as that. I think it's messy, and I think sometimes we just have to appreciate the challenges that we might face, and really just thinking that it is qualitative work can be problematic as much as we love it and we thrive in those moments. It can be quite complicated when you're trying to navigate that field. But I think there's something important about demonstrating some of these real life struggles, and I think it's just important about the difficulties of doing ethnography. It isn't straightforward, and often we find ourselves with groups of people that are amazing people but have very little time for us, and I think we have to acknowledge that, and somehow we have to then fit into their world to understand what is actually going on, and therefore you've got to work through some of those doubts, but there's some longevity to that. Think about when you do leave that field, how do you leave it? What impact have you had on it? How do you remain in contact or not with those people that you spent such amount of time with, and then all of a sudden you go, hey, I've got my data, see you later, and that's something I think we should try and avoid going forward, because these are people's lives as well. So I think ethnographic work is a beast in itself, but there's some tips and tricks, I guess, in the paper that just help you grapple with some of those negotiations of, let's call them those micro-political interactions, because that's what they are when we think about it sociologically, the power relations, the ethical dilemmas. And I think practically it might just help a few people resonate with some of those challenges. So it's not a one-word answer, I'm sorry about that, but it's the best I got, really.
Perfectly fine. Harley, you mentioned at the start of the podcast about an hour ago how good it was to look back, but we also like to look forwards on these kind of things. So what's next for Dr. Harley-Jean Simpson? You've already teased us with a potential paper that's coming later, but what else have you got on your plate? What should we be keeping an eye out for?
So we see these papers or the snippets of actually what happened in that data collection. So the next phase will be telling you that front stage story of what went on, and giving you some elements of those decisions that were made. And then I think there's probably a methods paper here where we can acknowledge some of those arts-based methodologies. And I have a lot more drawings and pictures to share, so I think we'll give that a go at some point. But that anything in this social pedagogic space is, I think, at the moment where I spend my time, and understanding I still have that big question of why do we do things a certain way, and that will stay with me for a while. So yeah, I have a few different projects going on, where I'm stretching out to some theological work of how sport chaplains navigate that space. Thinking about the paper we just spoke about, navigate the space that they're in within a high performance setting. Therefore, how do they go about their work? So that's a project we're at the moment. So yeah, there's lots of little things going on. So yeah, I'm really excited just to keep hopefully contributing to the field. I guess that's the aim, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Harley, just before we finish, we ask all our guests if there are any kind of myths within sport coaching that they'd like to dispel on the podcast, or maybe some things that I guess vex them. It could be related to what we've spoken about today, or generally anything to do with coaching that you'd like to maybe comment on.
Yeah, this is a nice question to finish on. I think I'm fascinated with the concept of care. It's a popular term right now, and I think some of my attributes, I hope to think I'm quite a caring person, and some of the people that I'm around, you can see elements of care, especially in sport and teaching and coach. It fits, and I love the work Column's doing. I think it's excellent, and it's really pushed the field forward. But because I've been around high performance sport, my research and some of the work we're doing now within some of the football settings, there is a little bit of a wrestle for me, and I don't know about other people, but there's a wrestle when I'm not saying you can become too caring. I'm not sure I'm putting myself there, because to care, that's part of it. But when we start to think about winning, in high performance, is there a little bit more that needs to be thought about? When, does your environment become just a caring environment? What happens if you're not winning? And therefore then, well, who will drag us out of this relegation battle, or who will drag us out of this 3-4 loses on the bounce? So there's an element for me where I'm thinking I'm fully on board with the concept of care, but when it becomes in a high profiled all or nothing context, I'm going to say it, can we be too caring? I don't know. And that's something I've been thinking about for a couple of weeks. So it's a really nice question to think about. It's not necessarily a myth, but, when we're not winning and there's no results coming our way, what happens to care? So yeah, I have no answers for you, but it's just something that I can't really get out of my head at the moment.
No, that's good. That's good. Quickly make a note of it before you forget it.
I've already wrote it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Harley, it sounds like you've got some really interesting work on the horizon, plenty to do. So without a shadow of a doubt, we'll look forward to having you back on the pod when you've got something else for us. Really appreciate your time today coming to speak to us about this particular paper. For the listeners and for the viewers, it'll be in the podcast description, but that brings us to an end of this episode. So thank you once again, Harley. Cheers to Ollie for being here with us as well. Thanks also to the sport broadcast team, specifically Alex, who's in the booth for us today. Couldn't do this without them. We'll be back with another episode soon. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ec.uk.